So we meet again, Velasquez.
Yes, we do.
How should we start this thing?
I think that was a good intro. We meet again. We meet again.
We meet
For the last time.
Yes.
At least in this context, for the next 4 weeks.
And I got to say, you've been very, very consistent on letting everyone know that. I mean, like, one last thing.
One last thing.
Don't
forget,
thing.
I am not
You
going,
don't want one person showing up.
Well, here's the problem, right? It's, we don't always come to all the things. And it's not like we're doing a lot of announcements on Sundays anymore. So it's like, so then I got to sneak in my announcements. I would point out, of course, you don't bother with that kind of thing like I do. So you and I have a different philosophy.
Yeah.
A different philosophy.
Yeah. You're probably right, and I'm indifferent. So. Well,
that's true. All right.
I'll miss you, buddy. Have a great summer break.
You and I are going to see each other, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Here, and we will see each other here on June 15th.
Well, what do you think, Matt? Should we keep recording anyway then?
Yeah, what do you think, Matt?
Okay. Well, let's start this thing for one last time. In 5, in 4, 3, 2, 1. Rolling. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm Tuck, and
I'm Tom.
And together we are Tuck and Tom. Pretty good.
It's really exciting.
Really good.
Really good.
I have a feeling we're going to look back on these shows years from now, and that's when they'll really going to have.
We might. You know how many times I've gone back and rewatched or re-listened to anything I recorded? I know I've done it, but really rarely.
Well, not yet, you haven't. But these are all little time capsules of theology.
Well,
really.
I also think the only times I've ever done it is for two purposes. One is if I was teaching back when we had 3 services a Saturday night. If I was teaching the next morning, I'd listen to it to kind of get ready.
Fair enough.
And then the other thing is if I go on a big break, say a 4-week break, and I'm not going to be teaching every week. Where was I?
Well, thanks for letting us know, Tom.
I need to explain my process.
The people had questions, but we've lost them all. Okay, well, as always, you teach through the Bible on a Wednesday night, and then we get together after that teaching, and we gather little questions that may come up, and then we put you in what we call the theological hot seat. And
yes.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree, and this is of course the segment that we call
the hot seat.
Oh, I thought it was a segment we called the People Have Questions.
Oh, yeah. I was like, okay, we're calling it the hot seat.
I thought it was called the People Have Questions.
All right, this is a segment that we call, Tom, the People Have Questions. And then I flick the page. Tom, the People Have Questions. Are you ready to answer them?
I am ready. Yep.
Very good. Well, we have a handful of questions today. And then, of course, we will make some announcements at the end of the show.
Will we?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That we will not have a show next week.
Just to make sure everybody knows.
Don't
forget everybody.
Oh, don't forget. Okay. First question comes to us from Cody.
Yes, which, shout out to Cody.
Whom?
So it's not the Cody that I had previously thought. This Cody had sent in a couple of questions, and forgive me, I actually don't know last names either.
How do you know?
This Cody, because last night this Cody came up and introduced himself, and he actually asked me this question also.
And then he said, I want to see it on the pod.
No, I think he already put it on, so then he just thought to ask it since we were
skipping this question, Cody. Yeah. Glad you got your answer. But
shout out to Cody. The week before, I thought it was the other. There's another Cody, of course.
Yeah, of course. There's more than
so I shouted out him as well, but I don't know his last name either. So.
Wow.
Okay, anyway.
To all the Codys out there.
To all the Codys.
The ones you haven't met, or no?
Yes.
All of them, or just the 2?
I say, well, specifically those 2 I'm shouting out.
Make your piece.
Yeah.
Say what you need to say. Do you want to say anything?
Oh, thanks, guys. Thanks for being a part of our time and our study. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me ask on behalf of Cody here.
Yes.
Cody 2.
Yes.
This is not Cody 1.
Yes.
You said in verse 10, the first king is Caesar Augustus, but wouldn't it be Julius Caesar? That makes sense to my little brain.
Yes. And I'm so glad this question actually came in because I had 3 people ask me this. And no, Julius Caesar was not an emperor of Rome. That's a mistake. I've actually heard.
There must be a common mistake.
Well, people always think of Julius Caesar as the first, and I understand why. It's not like there's a reason for it not to happen, so to speak. But Here, let me lay the foundation of the relationship of Julius Caesar. And guys, if you're not interested in history, like if you're not like
skip ad,
then now's the time to skip to the next little like I think
Yeah.
Matt, you
Bookmark.
put little
He
bookmarks
does.
on.
He
You
bookmarks.
could skip over this because I'm gonna, I think, go into quite a little bit of a
Are you telling us all to get comfortable?
yeah, get comfortable.
Okay, what's the title of this monologue?
This monologue is called The Caesars.
The Caesars, and the Caesars, how we got the very first Caesar.
How we got the
Is the
first emperor
subtitle?
and why Julius Caesar was not one of them.
How about Meet the Caesars?
Meet the Caesars. Meet the Caesars.
Leave it to Caesar.
Yes, leave it to Caesar.
Okay.
So a little bit of context. I'm going to try to be as fast as I can. The last 2 centuries BC, so the last 2 centuries prior to the birth of Christ, was the most tumultuous time in what we call the Roman Republic. The Romans ruled over a good chunk of the world by this point. But it would be proper to call it the Roman Empire because they were an imperial power. That is,
And superpower.
They were the superpower at that point. However, they were unique amongst all the kingdoms that we talk about in antiquity because they were not ruled by a king. They were ruled by a republican government, not unlike our own. In fact, the American government was largely founded, not really based upon the model of the old Roman republican government, but it was inspired by the old Roman republican
Greeks.
government. More the Romans. But
Okay.
yeah, the Greeks a little bit. The Greeks were more democratic. Like, I mean, if I'm just boiling it down to its most simple thing, and even when we say the Greeks, we're really talking about Athens. We're talking ultimately Athens in the 4th century, 4th and 5th centuries BC. Athens was a pure democracy, meaning that all the citizens of the city of Athens would actually vote on basically every political decision. So whoever you were, if you were a citizen, which of course there were lots of limitations, foreigners would not be citizens, women were not citizens. So it's like, and landowner, you basically had to own land of some kind. So actually, no, I don't think landowning was a requirement. You had to be born in Athens. Both your parents had to be Athenians. Then you had a right to cast your vote in the assembly, and you literally cast your votes for every kind of thing. Are we going to go to war? Are we not going to go to war? Who are we going to appoint as general? All these different kinds of things.
And so our country takes some of that.
We take a little bit of that. We have some elements of
But
democracy.
more Roman.
But the Romans were more of an inspiration to us, and I think if I was boiling it down simply, I would say, I'm oversimplifying. If a true Roman historian would probably take issue with some of the things I'll say here today. But if I want to oversimplify it, this republican form of government we might think of as a representative government. We don't directly go and cast lots cast votes for things. We instead appoint people to go and cast votes for us. The Roman Republic had a democratic element, but most of it was representative, right? They had representatives who made decisions. And the Romans had an executive branch of their government, just like we do. For us, it's the President of the United States. For the old Romans, the old Roman Republic, the consuls were the executives. Consul was the highest ranking office, and they ran the country, basically. And there were 2 of them. So they were equally powerful, the 2 consuls. And so they could check each other. And then the most powerful body in Rome was called the Senate, the Senate was comprised basically of a bunch of former politicians who had gone through, they call it the cursus honorum, which is like this whole system of politics. They'd been in politics for decades, right? After they get through all of it, then they're senators, they're Roman senators. And so the senators were the ones who had really the power. They were kind of the ones most vested in running the country. So the old Roman Republic was a republican form of government without an absolute ruler. And what people need to understand is the Roman Republic begins in 509 BC. Prior to 509 BC, Rome was governed by kings. So they had a traditional monarchy. Well, there was a revolution that drove those kings out. Those kings were overthrown, and this republican system was put in place, which is way ahead of its time. Republican systems were really uncommon, right? So, but the big thing is it gets inculcated kind of buried deep inside the Roman psyche that it was bad to have a king. Like, being a Roman, you just did not have kings. It's kind of funny how deeply cultural this goes. Like, when Russia went through its Soviet revolution, when it went through its Bolshevik revolution, the communists, in theory, there was not supposed to be a dictator. There was not supposed to be one single ruler. But if you're Russian, it's ingrained in you that you have a king. The Russian czars had ruled the countries forever. Same thing with the Chinese. Like the current president of China, President Xi, he is the emperor. Like it's the Chinese, it's just so ingrained in who they are. You have an emperor, and every leader of China, for all intents and purposes, has been an imperial authority. Xi has just brought back the imperial authority. Like the previous several presidents in China actually held to their term limits and stepped down after their term was done. And Xi's finally just said, you know what, we're just gonna go back to perpetual, going old school. But Mao Zedong, the founder of communist China, he was essentially the emperor. I mean, even though he didn't call himself that. Well, the Romans had also this deep thing inside their head where they're like, can't have a king, because it was ingrained in their national myth. Americans are similar. I don't think America will ever just have some kind of an absolute ruler come out and directly rule over us, because it's such a part of our mythology. It's like who we are. We got rid of the king, and we don't want a king. We don't do kings. Americans don't do kings. That's the way the Romans were.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is in that last 200 years, a civil war breaks out that's drawn very much along political lines. In fact, I've had a lot of people say that the last 2 centuries of Roman history greatly resemble the current era of American history, where you have these political divide, and the two sides are so aggressive and going against each other that civil wars just keep breaking out for the last 200 years. And over the course of the Civil War, certain individuals become prominent and very powerful. So even though it is an elected representative government, kind of like in our own country, 1 or 2 individuals can come out and be even more powerful than
the man of the people.
Yeah, exactly. Things like that, right? So it's like, for instance, Donald Trump is not currently the president of the United States. He's very powerful in our country because there are many people in our country who are beholden to him. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, he can say things and do certain things that has impact on the way people think and act and behave, right? He has a lot of power in that sense, just in virtue of who he is. And that's very much the way the Roman Republic was. Well, prior to Julius Caesar, there were 2 guys, and they were on political opposites. They were on the opposite end.
Liberal, conservative?
Liberal and conservative. And so the first guy who pops up is a liberal. Of course, in their own context, it's different from our kind of liberal conservative. But the first guy who popped up was a guy named Gaius Marius, who actually would become Julius Caesar's uncle. Not would become. He was Julius Caesar's uncle. Gaius Marius was a Roman general who was really well beloved, super popular. He was elected to be consul. And after serving as consul, he's like, I want to do that again, which was technically illegal.
Term limits.
There were term limits. But he's like, don't care, going to run for it. And he was so popular, he kept getting elected in spite of the fact you weren't allowed to, and he was able to keep violating it. And so all of his supporters like, we don't even care. We're going to keep voting for him because we love Marius and he's the best thing that's ever happened to Rome. But the conservatives who hated him are like, this is bad. He's violating the Constitution. The Constitution says term limits. He keeps running. And so I'm glossing over tons of things, but ultimately Gaius Marius would be elected consul 7 times, which is not allowed. And by the end, the conflict had basically gone so severe that the conservatives have their champion. Their champion's a guy named Cornelius Sulla, and Sulla was a very powerful guy. He was a general, and they end up fighting against each other. Sulla wins. And when Sulla comes into Rome, he goes through and he basically takes control of the city. And then now this is what's interesting. This is what a lot of people don't understand. In the Roman Constitution, the Republican Constitution, there was a rule in which the Senate could suspend the government and declare a dictator of Rome. And that dictator would have absolute power. He could do anything. But you got to understand, that's in the Constitution, of their Constitution. Like, this was a standard practice of the Romans. They could do it in the case of national emergencies. That's what allowed it. Because, and a lot of people don't realize this, but historically it was always believed that even if you had Republican or Democratic government, and even if they tended to work, they would not work at wartime or in times of disaster. You got to move quick. You got to have people who can cut through red tape, who can cut through bureaucracy. So the idea is you have to have people who can do literally whatever they want to get through those things. So because of that, the Roman Constitution had a potential dictatorship. America does not have that kind of provision, but we have things like it. Constitution, for instance, a lot of people don't know this, says that the President of the United States can suspend habeas corpus in times of national emergency. Habeas corpus, this might shock people. Especially like when you think about how intense we are about our rights, right? Habeas corpus is the fundamental rights that we have in terms of criminal investigations and stuff. The idea of habeas corpus is you cannot be arrested unless there is evidence that has been presented to a judge which says that we have reason to believe that you actually committed a crime. Without that, you cannot be arrested. U.S. Constitution says that the President of the United States can suspend that in a national emergency, which means he can just arrest people for no reason at all. That's actually in the Constitution. People don't know that. Abraham Lincoln exercised that right in the Civil War. He actually immediately, he arrested a ton of people who he deemed to be Southern sympathizers who were living in the North. Just took away the right of habeas corpus, threw them in jail, didn't need to put them on trial, any of those kinds of things. Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing in World War II. This is far more well known. He and the federal government were scared, suspicious of basically Japanese Americans. They feared that Japanese Americans might be traitors to our country. And so they suspended their habeas corpus, arrested them, and put them in these camps, right, along the western coast. And it's it's a black mark on our history and our country. A lot of people talk about it to this day, and a lot of people don't talk about it because it's such a black mark. But that was a constitutionally legal thing for him to do. During emergencies, presidents can suspend habeas corpus. So we have things like that in our Constitution, but we don't allow a dictator. But the Romans allowed a dictator. So in the midst of this civil war, Sulla comes in, and he and the Senate together proclaim him dictator. And his 6 months are up. Now, the way it traditionally worked is you only had 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, the Senate would get together, and they would determine whether or not the job was done or whether or not they needed to add another 6 months, right? So just kind of keep going.
Fair enough.
The shortest rule of a dictator in Rome was like 4 hours. The guy came in, did his job, went home, started farming. Actually, I hate to go on all these tangents. His name was Cincinnatus. And famously, like after his 4-hour job, which his only job was to find a traitor and execute him, he executed him. He said, okay, I'm done. And he took off his purple robe, which is what they wore. And then he went back to his farm and started working. Cincinnatus was a nickname that Americans gave to George Washington because Washington, after his second term, stepped down as president. In fact, that's where Cincinnati, Ohio gets its name, because Cincinnati, Ohio was founded as basically a colony is probably the wrong term, but like a little town of some of his former troops.
Amazing bonus material in
bonus
director's
material.
cut.
Yep. And you do not need to sign up for Calvary Plus or whatever.
No, that's all bonus material.
This is all free.
Yeah, Calvary Plus. So back to this.
Back to all of this.
So the 6 month dictatorship is over.
So Sulla comes in, but what Sulla did, which nobody had ever done. Again, during this crazy time, people are violating the Constitution. Sulla names himself perpetual dictator.
Interesting.
So what that means is he's dictator until he decides that everything has been restored to normal. That's the issue. So here's what people need to understand. That sets a precedent in Rome, right? Because Rome functioned on precedent, like the United States. When certain laws are when something is done and it establishes a precedent, then later on people feel like they're empowered to basically do the same thing.
Did it over there.
So he calls himself perpetual dictator, and then what he does is he uses his power and authority to bring Rome under control and establish peace, which he actually does. And when it's all done, he does what he was supposed to. He actually steps down. He called himself perpetual dictator, meaning I'm not going to let the Senate determine when I can step down. But he did actually end up stepping down and going into retirement. So he did what he was supposed to. He didn't actually stay dictator for the rest of his life. Now, it is into that world that Julius Caesar comes to power. Julius Caesar and he comes to power the way any normal Republican Roman did.
He's got some bloodline.
Yep, he does, and he gets elected to various offices, and he's eventually elected to consul, the office of consul. But at kind of the bit that everybody knows about him, that is kind of towards the end of his life, and he wasn't really that old. He's going to be killed, as everybody knows.
Sorry to spoil it.
Yeah, spoiler, he gets killed. Towards the end of his life, Julius Caesar, again, they're still caught up in this constant political fighting. And it's still conservatives versus liberals. And Caesar's the liberal. So Caesar belongs to that liberal camp. And actually, interestingly, his former son-in-law, who's 25 years older than him, so that's kind of a weird thing, a guy named Pompey, who was kind of his mentor and stuff, but Caesar married his daughter to Pompey, who was 19 when Pompey was 63. But she died. But so Caesar and Pompey have a falling out, and Pompey becomes the conservative leader, and Caesar is the liberal leader.
Interesting.
Caesar ends up at a time when he is proconsul, that's the office he holds, which is like governor in a province, in the province of Gaul, modern-day France. The Roman Senate tells him it's time to come home and he has to come back, and he's not going to be a proconsul anymore, which is what the Constitution decreed. You only served as a proconsul for 1 year.
Did his term.
Your time, and he actually did more than his term. So the Senate's kind of like, it's time for you to come home. And he says, I can't do that, because he knows when he comes home, his political enemies are going to let him have it. So what he does is he comes back with an army, and he marches on Rome, which is obviously illegal. He leads his army from France, Gaul at the time is what it's called, into Rome, and he seizes control of the city, and Pompey and the Senate flee. So they actually flee and go to Greece, basically. And after that, a series of battles are fought between Caesar and Pompey. And then after Pompey is killed, with some of the other senators who are against Caesar, Caesar wins them all. And when he wins
When you
them
say
all,
Caesar, this is Julius Caesar. The original.
The original, yeah. Now there were Caesars before him, but he is the one everybody thinks of,
Yeah.
Julius Caesar. Caesar was his family name.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, his actual name is Gaius, his first name. His family name is Julius, and his clan name is Caesar. So Gaius Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar, that's what we always call him. Julius Caesar goes back to Rome, and now what he does is he follows precedent, right? He needs to bring peace back to the state. So he does what Sulla did, and he declares himself perpetual dictator. And that doesn't necessarily mean he plans to reign forever. He's just calling himself perpetual dictator, like Sulla called himself perpetual dictator. And he hopes that the people will think to themselves that at some point Caesar will step down once he's brought peace. Maybe he would have. I don't know, but I doubt it. So all that to say, he had a lot of political enemies still, especially because Caesar was distinctly gracious with his enemies. He wanted to reincorporate everybody back into Rome. He wanted to prove a gracious leader. So he had political enemies still present. He had political enemies in the Senate. And then, of course, the biggest thing is culturally, everybody started fearing that Caesar was trying to make himself a king. And you don't make yourself a king. That's kind of why I set everything up to begin with, is for the Romans, you don't make yourself a king. And of course, he wasn't using the language of king. He's calling himself a dictator, which is a perfectly acceptable title in the Roman Republic. And ultimately, that's why he's assassinated. A bunch of senators get together when they're meeting in the Senate House, and they catch him by surprise and assassinate him and kill him.
Daggers.
So he's not a Roman emperor. The office of Roman emperor doesn't exist. It's the old Roman constitution. And now, again, fast forwarding.
So they just lost their perpetual dictator.
Yeah.
Now, who fills
Okay,
that
so
role?
here's the thing. From the Senate's perspective, there shouldn't be a dictator anymore. We're going back to the Republic. We're going to elect consuls. Everything's going to go back like normal. That's what the conservatives want. That's what the Senate wants. However, you have a lot of people who followed Caesar, who loved him. You can't win a civil war if you're not very supported. So because of this, there are a lot of people against them. The belief, or everybody thought, that the person who was going to take over for Caesar was going to be Caesar's right-hand man, a guy named Mark Antony. But it ended up not being that, because to everyone's surprise, when they read Caesar's will, he had bequeathed his entire fortune, which was, and people can't wrap their heads around this, it was 1/3 of all the wealth of the Roman Empire. So
How did he acquire that?
it was military conquest. Military conquest.
Putting it all in his name.
It's just all his, yeah. When he goes, he takes it, boom. Military conquest and winning, beating his political enemies, coming into Rome, seizing goods. He just got really, really rich. I mean, 1/3. Whatever our gross national product is, like 1/3 of that. That's
Take the debt too.
Yeah, that's like what Caesar is.
Yeah.
So he bequeaths his entire fortune to his newly adopted son, a guy whose name was Gaius Octavius. Now, here's the thing. Gaius Octavius is not his son. Gaius Octavius is his grandnephew.
What's he doing here? Is it a chess move
So
here?
here's it. Well, to be honest, nobody knows what Caesar was doing. The best they can guess is he didn't have a legitimate heir, and he wanted an heir. So he wrote in his will so that he would have an heir, so that his goods wouldn't be dispersed back amongst the state. It's probably just something like that. But the weird thing is, Gaius Octavius only met Julius Caesar twice. They were not close. It wasn't like he raised him. Gaius Octavius was Julius Caesar's great nephew. That is, Julius Caesar's mother was Julius Caesar's sister was Gaius Octavius's grandmother. Okay, that's his relationship to Gaius Octavius. Octavius is 18 years old and has no political experience and very little military experience. And all of a sudden, he owns 1/3 of the wealth of the empire, right? So that's that he comes on the stage. Now, Gaius Octavius is going to become Caesar Augustus. When he is adopted by Julius Caesar, he actually takes a new name, and the new name he takes is Julius Caesar. Kind of how like just fathers adopting sons. So the name he actually officially had when he's adopted, after he's adopted, is his name changes from Gaius Octavius to Gaius Julius Caesar, which is the exact name that his adoptive father had. However, everybody called him Octavian, which was just kind of a slightly changed name of his birth father's name. So
where do we get Augustus?
Well, I'll get to that. So I'm going to run through this, but the Civil
too
War
late for that, dear.
The Civil War is now not over. Sorry, I actually love talking about
it's
this.
amazing.
It's actually like
really
super interesting to me.
We're gonna have to part two this.
Yeah,
this is the podcast.
I'm actually not too far off from being done with this.
Well, don't rush. You're talking about running, and you're but we're also talking about Cincinnati, Ohio somehow.
That's true. I did do some tangents. Okay, so here's the thing. Octavian is now like the wealthiest man in the empire and has enormous political power, but has no experience.
And is there a hit on his life? I mean,
no. What happens is the two sides are competing now for his affections. So now both the conservatives and the liberals are trying to get him on their side. This is where I'm going to do a big abbreviation because a lot happens over the next about 15 years of his life, but it ends with Gaius Octavius essentially having a falling out with Mark Antony, his dad, Julius Caesar's right-hand man, and they fight a civil war against each other. And this is actually the last of the civil wars. So Gaius Octavius actually ends the civil war by defeating Mark Antony.
And he turned out to be a shrewd guy.
Super shrewd. So here's the thing, and this is where it gets super interesting. Gaius Octavius, he's not even 30 years old. He defeats Mark Antony. So he's young. Defeats Mark Antony. By defeating Mark Antony, he has now no political opponents. He's the most influential person in the Roman Empire, right? Having become this very influential person, he goes back to Rome. He goes to the Senate, all old men, right? The men who killed Julius Caesar, his adoptive father. And he says to the Senate, he goes, "The Republic has been restored, thanks to me. I have restored the Republic." And he goes, "I am now going to retire from public life." He says, "I'm not a politician. I don't want to be involved in politics. I'm going to step aside and let the Republic be what the Republic was always meant to be." To which the senators say to him, "No, you cannot do this." They said, "You have saved our country. You are the father of our country, the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland," they say. And they're saying, "Please, you cannot leave us. We will be like children with no ability to move forward. You have to do something." He goes, okay, but you can never try to make me king or dictator." And they're like, "Never. We never would." He's, "All right, I will be consul," which, remember, consul's like the president's, the highest office. And he says, "And I will be consul just forever." And they're like, "Okay, sounds good." They're okay with that because they love him so much. He's so beloved. So he becomes consul, and he's consul for several years in a row. And they still would have elections, but whenever there was an election, remember, there were two consuls. So on one ballot, it would just be his name. He would just win. And on the other ballot, you'd have two guys going for the second consul. That goes on for a few years. And then Octavian goes, "Okay, wait a minute." He starts hearing rumbling because people are like, "Octavian's kind of acting like a king." So Octavian's like, "I can't do that." So he goes to the Senate and he goes, "Guys, I have to retire. I can't stay running for consul. People are thinking I'm a king. Can't be a king." And they're like, "You can't leave us. What are we going to do without you? You are absolutely essential to everything that we are doing. Like, you can't leave political life." And he goes, "Okay, I'll tell you what. I will stay in politics." And they're like, "Thank you." And he says, "But three things. Number one, I can never be consul again." And they're like, "Okay, fine. You're not consul again." He says, "Instead, I want two offices. These are two Roman Republican offices." They're like, "Okay, what are they?" Number one, he goes, "I want to be the tribune of the people." Now, the tribune of the people is a very interesting one. It's the lowest ranking office in the Roman government. So on the one hand, it's nothing, right? And also there's no limit to how many times you can be the tribune. You can be tribune forever, and nobody's going to think anything weird of it. So nobody's going to go, "You're trying to be the king." But here's the thing. It's the lowest office because it was the office for the common people. It was the office that spoke to the common people. And the Romans were classists, right? They think of higher classes as more important. So they think of it as low. But what does the tribune of the people have? He has two powers that are very important. Number one, he speaks to the people, meaning he is the representative of the Roman government who talks to the masses of the Romans. So who does that mean Augustus or Octavian is going to have on his side? He's going to have the people.
Yeah, the people.
The second thing that a tribune has is the tribune has a veto over every law that is passed. That's a pretty big power, right? So the tribune has a veto. So that's huge. So he becomes tribune. Then the second thing that he does is he asks to be granted the rank of imperator. Now, this is where we get our word emperor. An imperator in the old Roman Republic was just a general. That's all the word meant, was general. However, he wanted imperium, which was the power over all the armies of Rome. But he was shrewd about it. He said to the Senate, I don't want all the power, all the armies. Now, traditionally, the Senate is in charge of the armies. Because remember, the Senate is the most powerful body. So traditionally, they're the ones. They get to appoint generals and all that. He says, don't worry, I'm not taking all the armies. He goes, I only want these. And he pulls out a map and he points to all the armies he wants. And the senators are like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you can have those. Well, the armies that he selected were the armies on the frontier. That is the armies that were actually fighting. That is the armies that actually had trained and practiced and people who'd experienced battle. They were also the places where we needed the largest armies because they were the most potential threats. The Senate would control all the armies that were lazy, that had never done anything forever, that were inside the interior of the country where there's no real threat. So people look at that, which is 32 BC, that year, as the year that the emperor or the empire begins. That is, that the office of the emperor begins, because that is when they always say when Caesar Augustus becomes the tribune of the people and the imperator over the army, that's when the empire of Rome is established. That's when the emperor is begun. So from this point on, he is fundamentally running the country. But he doesn't tell everybody he is, because he doesn't want them to think he's trying to become king. But he is the king. He is running the country. When he dies, they open his will, and they find out that he is he had already an adopted son. He did not have his own son, Tiberius, who was the son of his wife. It was his stepson. And Tiberius is named his heir. And in his will, it says that Tiberius will inherit the office of the tribune and the office of imperator. And at that moment, that's when people realized, oh, these offices are no longer determined the way they used to be. They're actually passed on from father to son. Right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So
now you have an heir apparent.
Now we have an actual emperor, and it's clear. We have a father to son passing of emperor to emperor. That was not passed from Julius Caesar.
Wow.
So the empire. So what happens under Caesar Augustus is you have a new constitution that, as a trick, is snuck into the Roman Empire. And here's the thing. For the rest of the Roman Empire, they will keep all the republican offices. They'll keep the consuls. They'll keep the Senate. They'll keep all those things. But all of those things are just done to appease the people. It's like the Queen of England.
In reverse order.
In reverse order. It's like the reverse of the Queen of England.
Yeah.
And in the exact same way, the monarchs of England slowly gave up their power to Parliament, just slowly over time. There was one revolution that took the king out of power, and it was a disaster. So England asked the king to come back. And then it was a slow evolution of the monarchs slowly giving up power to Parliament, to where you're now at a point where Parliament is running the state. The prime minister is the real person running the country, but the king still gets his due honor publicly and is called the monarch because he's always been there, and we want to pay homage to it. Same thing with the Rome. Once you get Caesar Augustus, from that point on, the emperors are running the country, but they still have the offices, they still hold elections, they still do all those things. Just those people have no real power. They're just there as like a symbol. So that's a very long way to say.
Was amazing understanding that, and thank you, Cody, for asking such a question packed with so many answers. Was Caesar Augustus at all a bad player in writing his will in a way to kind of make the heir now kind of assume his power, or do you think that did he have bad intentions? And
what do you mean bad intentions?
Like, did he? It sounds like part of the
story. Are you talking
story,
Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus?
Caesar Augustus.
Yeah.
Did he? Part of it, he really did want to return to the Republic.
No, he was a bad player. He never wanted to return to the Republic.
Okay, that was all.
Yeah,
that's all posturing.
Yes, Caesar Augustus. By the way, I forgot to mention he receives the name Augustus right around the same time that he received the tribune of the people, the office of the tribune of the people, and the imperator, and imperium being called imperator. because at that same time he was named high priest also over the Roman state, which is just a whole nother facet of that, because if you're the high priest, you're now also the spiritual leader over the country. And Augustus was a religious title. So Augustus meant the August one, like August meant like holy and revered. So when he became Caesar Augustus, that was when he took that title to himself. And so then he was known as Caesar Augustus from that point forward.
And it was just the desire for power.
Yes. Oh,
motivated.
So now I will say this. You might say that Caesar Augustus, yeah, he probably wanted power. I don't want to say he's like this just insanely good guy. But Caesar Augustus believed for sure that the Republican system was broken and unfixable. So he really did believe the only way to bring peace to Rome was to have a dictator ruling. He believed that for sure. So did he do it for a desire for power? Yes, but he also really did believe that that was the only way to fix things. I find him amongst world leaders that you'll read about, he's as good as you find. You know what I mean? Like he was, I read a story about Caesar Augustus once that really kind of moved me, because one of my favorite Romans from this era is a guy named Cicero. And Cicero, I admire Cicero so much because he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and he was very much against the Caesars. He wrote a series of polemics against Julius Caesar, talking about why Julius Caesar was wicked and evil for his country. And during the interim phase when Caesar Augustus was rising to power, Mark Antony insisted that Caesar Augustus, before he became Caesar Augustus, kill Cicero. So he did. He had Cicero killed, which bums me out. But I read an anecdote of a time when Caesar Augustus is an old man in his 60s. He walks into his home and he sees his grandson, Tiberius' son. So his, not his biological grandson, but his grandson is sitting there reading. And he says, "What are you reading, son?" And he hides the book and puts it away. It's nothing. And he goes, "No, come here. I want to see it." And it was works of Cicero. And his grandson hid it because he knew Grandpa had killed him. And then the way the story goes is he sat down and he started reading the book. And as he read, he started crying. And he says, "He was a good man, son, a good man and a patriot." So he wasn't like a lot of these really wicked, crazy emperors who are megalomaniacal. I think he was a guy who really did want to do what was best. Power hungry, probably, but not like at a level that so many people are.
How corrupt do the Caesars become over?
It took almost no time. It was like with Tiberius. So with Augustus the first, it's like not corrupt really, and the state is really good. They call that the period of the Pax Augusta, which is like the Augustan peace. So there was just a period of until that point, like just an unrivaled peace after all that time of civil war. Tiberius did pretty well for like the first half of his reign, and then he really kind of lost interest in ruling and became weird, and the empire started going through some real difficulties. Then you get to Caligula the Third. Caligula is a nickname. His name was actually Gaius Julius Caesar, just like the first Caesar. Caligula was evil and crazy, like truly insane. Like he completely lost his mind.
And these are all bloodline.
Yeah, no. Well, they're almost all adopted. It's all the same family, and there are this strong interworking like connections of relations, but most of them are adopted at different points. Very few are actually. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head if any of them are blood related. Like wow. Tiberius is truly Caesar Augustus's stepson, so he's blood related to Augustus's wife, but he has no blood relation to Augustus, and Caligula. They're all in the family a bit, but they're not. He's not directly related. Caligula was horrible, just insane. He appointed his horse to be consul of Rome, which it's like at that point you're just like, what are you doing? Yeah. His successor Claudius was good. Claudius was a pretty effective ruler, and then Claudius precedes Nero, and Nero of course was insane.
But then soon you get Constantine.
It's a while before Constantine, but the period everybody raves about amongst the Roman in the Roman Empire is shortly after the period I've been talking about. So I mentioned yesterday, as it says in Revelation 17, you have 5 good emperors, and then there are 2 who are still to come, which I posit are the first 2 Flavian emperors, which are Vespasian and Titus, and then you have Domitian, and Domitian is like Nero. He's the one I'm arguing has come in the spirit and the power of Nero in a sense. He's the same as Nero, but like Nero, because Nero brought an end to his dynasty. That was an end of his dynasty. Diocletian brings an end to the Flavian dynasty, which was the second dynasty, because he's so corrupt and bad, and his own troops kill him. And what happens then is the period of the 5 good emperors. Edward Gibbon refers to those next 5 emperors. He says, it was the best time in all of human history to live. In terms of peace, prosperity, standard of living, length of life, medical facilities, up until Gibbon's time, which would have been the 18th century. So it's not like he had the modern era to look at, or the contemporary era that we live in.
Look at us. So
yeah, it's probably
living
true.
on fast food diets.
Yeah, but it was a great era,
air.
and those 5 emperors are always referred to as the 5 good emperors. And I will say, of all the world rulers I've studied that are not mentioned in the Bible, most of the ones even in the Bible are pretty wicked and corrupt. But with the exception of like David and Hezekiah. David, Hezekiah, and Josiah, and maybe a couple other of the good kings, they're pretty worthless too. When you study ancient human rulers, most of them are just really bad. These 5 were pretty awesome. And the 5 are Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Those 5. Marcus Aurelius is literally my favorite world ruler that I've ever read about. Like, he's the only guy I've ever read where I thought, that guy ruled only out of a sense of duty. He didn't even want to be ruler. He did it because it was his duty, and he did it to the best of his ability. I'm not saying everything he did was perfect, but I really do believe he was motivated by really like a good desire to be good.
So as we sometimes say, all of that to say, Cody, the first king is not
Julius Caesar. The first emperor is not Julius Caesar. The first emperor is Caesar Augustus. Now, I know I could have just said that. However, I don't know. The truth is, I love talking about it, so I felt like going off on that tangent, and I felt like it might be of interest to some of you.
It's
I know
amazing.
Some of you wouldn't be interested, but it was something I was really also for those who might be incredulous. I did have a friend came up to me right afterwards. I guess I could do shout out to Hartley. He was like, "What about Julius Caesar?" And I said, "Julius Caesar wasn't." He goes, So this is kind of like to try to explain that historians don't. Nobody reckons, not in that day, not historians now. Nobody reckons Julius Caesar as one of the emperors. So anyway,
Matt, we're going either into a speed round or a part 2. What do you guys think?
I think a lot of this is speed round.
Well, of course you think that, because
the only one I'm worried about is the last one, and I think everything else we can do quicker.
I'm going to save the last one then.
We got 5 weeks. Let's just try it. Let's try. Let's
save
go.
Because
let me look at time.
It's 5:07.
We can do this. Mark my words. We'll be done by 5:30.
Marcus Aurelius, your words.
Okay. Marcus Aurelius, your words. Okay.
Okay. This is speed round then.
Okay.
Matt, can you start the clock, please? Okay. Matt is starting the clock. You're going to have to edit out Cincinnati, Ohio.
Stop talking. We got to go.
All
speed
of
round.
these next
Yes.
ones.
Okay.
But before we start the speed round, I want you to put on your seatbelt.
Okay. Seatbelt's on.
Okay. But by the way, that was awesome.
Okay. Good.
That was a standalone episode for me.
Praise the Lord.
But for you, you're a man committed to all the questions. Okay, we have a question from Anonymous. During the Dark Ages, where was God's word?
Yeah, that's simple question or simple answer for this. God's word was there, and people were reading it. I said I probably needed. I need to qualify sometimes how I say certain things. When I said nobody could read, I was being hyperbolic. Reading was preserved in monasteries. You had a percentage of people around Europe who could still read, but they were very, very small percentage, like so small it would not show up on any statistical reckoning of any kind. So they were usually people in monasteries, monks. Monks preserved the ability to read and to teach the scriptures, and they copied the scriptures. So monks were committed to copying scriptures. But I also want to add something else. When I talked about that, it was for Western Europe. This is not talking about the Byzantine Empire. In Greece and Turkey and those regions over there, they're under the Byzantine emperors. And the Byzantine emperors have a thriving civilization with lots of literacy, and it's a Christian empire. So you have tons of people reading the scriptures in that era during that time. By the way, in 800, when Charlemagne comes to power, it will be under Charlemagne, literacy will rise to 5%. And by that time, like once you get to 5%, that's going to really start a cascading effect of people learning how to read and growing in literacy rates. And then you have the word of God really spreading a lot. But of course, the big spread comes in the 1400s when the printing press the movable type printing press is invented.
Amazing. Matt, How we doing on the good speed?
We're
there?
good. Keep going.
Okay. He's nervous.
I'm not nervous.
Okay, good. Okay. Cold Focus. How about that for
I
a
like
name?
that. I like that name.
It's a good
Shout out
name.
to Cold Focus. Not that I know who Cold Focus is.
But it's a good name.
It's a good name.
I want to call you Cold Focus. Could the meteor that was thrown into Rome be symbolic for the invasion from Germany?
Yeah.
You said 1/3 of Romans died.
Yes. So here's what I would say to that. Maybe. Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of frame this question a little bit.
Tell us about the Germans invading.
Well, so what I said yesterday, and I pointed out that at the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the Germanic invasions, which is a little bit of a oversimplification. It's not like you have one nation of Germany that's invading Rome and Rome can't fight it. Germany is this far-off wild land where tribal peoples live. Like they're living in tribes. They're living in tents. But they're very tough people. They live in very cold climate weather, and they're trying to move south because moving south is warm climate. And that's the one thing's pretty consistent throughout human history is the people in the north want to move south. They want to move south. They want to be at the Mediterranean.
The imperialists always come from the cold.
They always come from the cold because they
tiny little rainy island. It's like, let's get out of here.
But also the cold makes you tough, right?
Yeah.
The cold just makes you really tough. And the Romans at the end of their empire have been soft for a long time.
Yeah, well,
they're just not ready to fight. And the Romans did all sorts of things to try to placate the Germans. In fact, one of the big moves that the Emperor Theodosius did, who was the last like really powerful emperor over the whole empire, the Emperor Theodosius brought a lot of Germans into his army. He actually made his commanding officer of the whole army a German. He thought, you can't beat them, join them. Let them come and defend Rome. And that was actually pretty effective for a while until the Germans were like, we're running things anyway. Let's just, So it was kind of a complex thing of Germans coming all over, coming across the Danube and the Rhine rivers and into Rome in all sorts of different places, and the Romans not being able to do anything to stop it. And it took place over a couple of hundred years. Like this is a slow process.
Yeah.
So having said that, over the course of that process, the population of Europe decreased dramatically. Partly from the Romans or from Germans killing them, partly from disease, partly from famine, partly from destruction of infrastructure. But it's massive and colossal. And so then the question here is, why couldn't it be that, say, a meteor striking the earth that's mentioned in the book of Revelation describing these could be symbolic of the Germans coming in and killing 1/3 of the population? My answer to that question is it could be. It absolutely could be. So I want to be careful and point out that even though I try, when I'm reading through the text, to give you the basic 4 interpretations, I don't always explain how every interpreter takes every verse, because that would just be so tedious. It would just take too long. That is a totally legitimate interpretation of that people do have. So preterists and historicists do, in fact, interpret things like the mountain being thrown into the sea or as being metaphors or symbols of other events that did happen. And then this observer rightly says that I said that about 1/3 of the Romans died. Now, this is all guesswork. We don't really know how many died because we don't have good rolls of population. We just know it decreased a lot. So, this would be a good observation. We just can't say for certain. Now, by the way, I think we should tie this one to the Jim Quinn question.
Let's bring in Jim Quinn then. So with all of that in mind, if some verses do not fit a particular interpretation, why not look for an interpretation which does?
Yeah, and so that's a really great question, Jim. And the answer I think to that is that we always are. So I hope everybody understands that when I say that, man, like when I taught last night, we're reading chapters 17 and 18. Chapters 17 and 18 really well fits this picture of the fall of the Roman Empire. It just does it like so amazingly well that it's really hard to say. It seems so airtight. When I brought up the other passages, I was just simply trying to point out the weakness of that position. I wanted people to understand that the book of Revelation still remains for me a book that when I read it all, I can't confidently take the whole book and say, oh, I know exactly what this is referencing. I can't confidently make that assertion, or that kind of assertion, because so many times I don't see things that fit. They just don't like there's so many things in the book of Revelation that we've read so far that I didn't see necessarily fitting in the destruction of Rome. And so I mentioned some of those yesterday, and presumably, Jim, what you're asking is, well, then seek one. And I think this is good. Why don't you seek one that would account for all of these things? And the problem is, I am doing that. That's exactly what I'm doing. I think that's what we all should do when we're trying to read the scripture. Anytime we're trying to read a book of scripture, we're trying to come up with the interpretation that best accounts for all the information there. And also
the holistic approach.
And also to find out what is most likely to be true. But what I'm saying when we read 17 and 18 is what is most likely by far that those passages are talking about is the destruction of the Roman Empire. So taking that and fitting it into other passages in the book of Revelation is hard, because a futurist interpretation might make more sense for mountains being thrown into the sea. But a futurist interpretation does not make sense for chapter 17 and 18. And when a futurist comes up with a story about a new Roman Empire, like
the Holy Roman Church.
The problem is that just doesn't actually fit the text of what it's talking about. Like whatever this new Roman Empire is, it's not persecuting Christians in the way that we read in that particular text. Maybe it will. And maybe that is the answer. But I do want to point out that when you're talking about it, you can't approach a text and say, well, I'm just going to shove this off to a future if I can't explain it now. Because sometimes there are things that just seem like they are meant to be explained right now. And so because of that, the most likely thing is that, So, and this is the way it works when you're reading any passage of scripture, right? Any doctrine that comes up. It's like the doctrine of the Trinity. You read that there's one God. That's a passage, right? That's very logical, very rational. We read that all over the place. Deuteronomy 6:5, Hear, O Israel, there's one, or the Lord your God, the Lord is one, right? But then you also read, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And you're like, well, wait a minute. Now I have a tension. If I follow the Jewish interpretation, then these two things contradict. I can't, because you can't have somebody who is both with God and God. That doesn't make any sense. So how do I make there be one God, but also make that God be three persons? I have to come up with an interpretation that kind of tends to fit all the passages. But that's a hard thing to come up with. I do believe that with that, the church has been successful coming up with the doctrine of the Trinity and saying this is what accounts for all the passages. But for a lot of things, we have not been very successful in coming up with a narrative that accounts for everything. I don't believe the future.
Mainly the book of Revelation.
And the book of Revelation is a big one for that. Yeah.
But great question, Jim. And I will say, of course, I think you're trying to do that to your best ability, but I think you're being so fair.
I'm trying to
every passage of Scripture to give each of the four views their due respect. You know?
By the way, I did want to tie that with Cold Focus really quickly, because what Cold Focus just did is he tried to do what you're asking, Jim. He basically said, so what Cold Focus is doing is Cold Focus is saying 17 and 18 sound like it's the fall of the Roman Empire. And now he's looking back at the seals that we read about, not the seals, but the bowl judgments. And the trumpet judgments. And he's like, well, why you said yourself that this fall of the Roman Empire led to the death of a third of the people. So why couldn't one of those things fit? What he's doing is he's now taking the interpretive scheme and expanding it out. And I think that's totally legitimate.
He's getting mileage now.
Yeah, he's getting totally. What he's doing is he's trying to create a system that makes sense. And I'm very open to that. I just am less confident in that than I am about 17 and 18. If that makes sense. Yeah. I'm like, I can understand, I guess, why somebody else would come in and say, why would you say like a star falling from heaven if it's not this? Like I can understand why somebody would say this. Or somebody could perhaps say this, that actually if you look back at it, the seal judgments talk about a fourth of the land being destroyed. The bowl judgments the trumpet judgments talk about a third, and then the bowl judgments talk about a half. So it's like there are even different numbers being discussed. So it's like, how do you
do your best? But
you do your best.
Not, obviously, it's not. It's not simple.
Exactly. And what the futurist does,
which is why four views have great moments throughout the study.
That's exactly right. And what the futurist does is the futurist looks at the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments, and says many of these things definitely have never happened. So then they place that in the future, and then they go, 17 and 18, man, what do I do with these? And then it really seems to fit the destruction of the Roman Empire. So I guess we're going to instead move that to the future and say...
we got to push it all to the future.
And we're going to say that there's going to be a new Roman Empire with new persecutions of Christians and all this. And I don't want to say that couldn't happen any more than I want to say that it couldn't be the case that the meteor was Germany.
But
it's
everybody's
very possible.
making concessions.
But
right
everybody's making concessions because 17 and 18 really seems to be about the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Cool. Okay, well, we have another question that I think... Anonymous definitely asks, and you're going to have to do your best. Could spend an entire hour on this, but let's do our best to put you back into the they call this the 2-minute drill.
Yes.
In football.
Yes.
You're in the 2-minute drill, Tom.
2-minute drill.
You got one timeout.
Yes.
You're getting low on timeouts.
Okay.
And you're marching down the field. You're picking up first downs.
We could just move right into it.
Should we do it now?
Yes, let's get right into it.
Matt's giving me the move along signal.
Yes.
Okay. What do you think about the digital currency? And will you accept a chip on your hand to be able to buy or sell? Second question, does Revelation say anything about current world events?
Yeah, so to the
Two
first
questions.
Yeah, so the first question, what do I think about digital currency? I don't have a problem with digital currency. I don't think that the book of Revelation is speaking to digital currency. I think the best explanation for the mark of the beast was those certificates that people would get for sacrificing. I am less confident of that than I am the things we read elsewhere in 17 and 18, but I think that's the best explanation.
Okay, now
I don't have a problem with digital currency. Second part of that question, though, is will you accept a chip on your hand to be able to buy or sell? And the answer to that is no.
You will not.
No, I will not, because even though I think I gave the best answer is those certificates.
I'm
not 100% certain at all.
It look a little different if they start charging.
If somebody comes
barcode your arm.
If somebody comes up and says, "I have to put something on your right hand or on your forehead, or else you cannot buy or sell, and if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you," I would just go, "Okay, that actually." That's
getting too close.
That's
for me.
getting too close for me.
That's getting too close.
At that point, I would be like, that's too literal.
I'm out on the chip in the hand as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I'm also out on Neuralink and I don't want
anything.
anything.
On I'm passing on all the transhumanism stuff
in my body.
I'm out.
No, I'm out on all that.
I'm like a Shark Tank.
Yeah,
I'm out, dog.
Yeah. But I'm fine with like computer currency and all that. Just like as long as it's not in me or on me, I'm good.
Okay. Well, good to know. And then, do you think anything in the current events is fulfilling the book of Revelation?
So let me say
it's
this.
a very common question that
it
the
is.
book of Revelation can be, the Gog and the Magog and the Russia and Ukraine or whatever you want to.
Yes. So here's the thing. My answer to that is I'm not certain, and I think it certainly could be. Like so keep in mind, I am not I have not, and I really am not just saying this. I'm not somebody who just says the futurist view is wrong. I think the futurist position could be right. And if the futurist position is right, then the book of Revelation would be speaking about events perhaps now or in the future, if the futurist view is right.
At some point,
yes,
the headline news will line up with Revelation.
Correct. Now, I am not very confident, though, that the futurist view is correct. In fact, I'm inclined to be somewhat against it. Like, I think it's very possible, but I find it not the least convincing, but I find the historicist view the least convincing. But the futurist view is the second least convincing to me. And because of that, I'm inclined to think, actually, that the book of Revelation, it says a lot to us today about how we should live and stuff. But if the futurist view is wrong, then no, Revelation is not talking about current events or future events. But I think it might be, but I think it might be, but I'm inclined, if you're holding me to it, to say probably not. That's what I'd say. One more thing, though, and this is something I'm going to talk more about as we get into these last 3 chapters of Revelation. I do believe that God works in patterns so that you find things happening repeatedly throughout time. So I've already brought up the fact that the old Maccabean War that's prophesied in the book of Daniel lasted 7 years. And halfway through that war, at the 3.5-year mark, there's a significant event. And so, too, the Judean War with the Romans, that lasted 7 years. And halfway through is a significant event, the destruction of the temple. So you have a repetition there of these wars between world powers and the Jews. The first one, the Jews win. The second one, they lose. But they both last 7 years. They both have a 3.5-year mark. So, yeah, maybe there'd be another war that lasts 7 years, or maybe there'll be another big event like a tribulation that lasts 7 years.
Or the
I'm open to
fall of an empire that was once a republic, and then a dictator comes in.
Exactly. So I'm very open to that. In fact, I'm inclined to think that is true, that to whatever degree Revelation is speaking about something in the past, it's very probable that it is also setting a framework for patterns of things
to
that are
that
coming in
point,
the future.
the story of Rome is starting to sound a lot like the story of the United States.
Correct.
Which could set the stage for both the chapters that we studied last night to be about Rome and a future empire falling.
Yep. By the way, if anybody wants, I'd recommend a book by a guy named Mike Duncan. It's called...
Talking about Matt Duncan? Shout out to Matt Duncan.
Who's that?
Matt Duncan? Matt and Malia. They go to the Wednesday night
Oh,
service.
sorry. I didn't know Matt's last name. I know Matt and Malia. I always think Matt and Malia. So shout out to Matt and Malia. Sorry, I didn't know your last name.
And awesome Book of Revelation students.
Absolutely.
So
Mike Duncan.
Matt Duncan.
Well, I'm talking about Mike Duncan.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time for this, Tom.
Okay,
Let's stick to the point.
Mike Duncan did a podcast called The History of Rome, and he wrote a book called The Storm Before the Storm. And he published it around 2015, I want to say, somewhere around there. The Storm Before the Storm is this period of Roman history right before Caesar comes to power that talks about how divisive and crazy Roman politics were. And he basically posits the thesis that the period in American history that most resembles that is where we are now. And it's a pretty compelling thing.
I think that's one way where a guy like Jim Quinn and some of the find an interpretation. It's like, well, you might have more than one interpretation.
You might have,
accurate.
and I'm very open to more than one interpretation.
Yeah.
And then last question.
Last question. You have 2 minutes to answer this question. I'm so sorry, but I have to limit your time on this.
I will try to be fast. Yeah.
You have literally a 2-minute drill right now. So ready?
Yep.
This is from our good friend Jenny Baker.
Jenny Baker. Shout out to Jenny and Leon, both.
Why not?
Might as well.
You mentioned that verses can be misused. Example of slavery. What ways can we avoid misinterpreting Scripture based on tradition or culture? Example, women and their roles.
Yes. Jenny, I wish I could go into a lot of detail on this, but I spent so much time talking about Julius Caesar, and I apologize for that. So
no apology accepted. That was awesome.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, everybody, and this is going to sound bad, we have to get comfortable recognizing that we are going to misinterpret Scripture. We're human. We make mistakes, and we're going to misinterpret, and sometimes our Bible teachers are going to misinterpret. I have a couple of bits of advice that I think are really important. Number one, read the Scripture a lot. The more you read it, and like really read it, not just open up a passage, read a verse, and close it and be done for the day. Study the books of the Bible. The more you read it, the more you're going to understand it. Like you will know the Scripture the more you read. Number two, listen to lots of teachers. Lots of teachers from different backgrounds. Don't stick with one guy. Like, you may have your guy who you love, and keep loving him. Listen to him, but diversify your teachers and try to get guys from different backgrounds. You get a Calvary teacher or two that you really love. Listen to them. Like, I hope people who are listening to my Revelation class are listening to other guys. Partly what I hope I contribute, if nothing else, it's that in 21st century America, so much of the teaching is about futurism and kind of that interpretation, dispensationalism, that kind of futurism in particular, that I hope to provide just like some other considerations. But I do hope people are listening to the futurists as well. Like, listen to all these different, and when you're listening, try to judge, not judge like the person, not like looking at a person and saying, well, you're bad because you're teaching wrong, but try to judge the arguments of what's being said and then reason through it and try to figure out which one makes the most sense of the text. And so, read people from Baptist backgrounds, from Calvary backgrounds, from legitimate Christian backgrounds, by the way. I'm not saying go out and read every cult that pops up or anything like that. But, read Presbyterian stuff and Methodist stuff, read their arguments, listen to their sermons, try to figure out what they say on different particular passages. And, just get as much of those takes as you can. Proverbs 18:17, the case of a man sounds good until he is cross-examined. So it's like something sounds good until you hear the opposing view.
I never even heard that part.
When I taught 17 and 18 last night, so many people came up to me and they're like, I've never thought of this. Yeah. And that's just because you haven't heard it. That's all. So now, by the way, I think you might have the impression that nobody teaches this because you haven't heard it. But the answer is no. I've been hearing this stuff since I was 18. When I heard it at 18, I was like, what? Like, I'll never forget the first guy who brought up some of this stuff to me. He was at a Christian bookstore that I was visiting. And I was like, I slowly started walking.
What a cool interaction. This guy's just hanging out in a Christian bookstore. I started walking
backwards like there's a heretic inside. Until I came to realize there are a lot of people who believe things like this. Yeah. It's just that we get stuck in our echo chambers.
We get stuck, don't we?
And so we need to hear more stuff. So that's my biggest bit of advice. And then also just recognize that you're not going to be perfect with it. Like, you're going to make mistakes and be willing to learn. Like, just go through and read commentaries, listen to pastors. There are background commentaries out there that are really helpful, and there are manners and customs books like Manners and Customs of the Bible that you could look through and kind of find some really good stuff. I do highly recommend InterVarsity Press's background commentary to the Bible. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament, and there's a new edition of it on Amazon. Pretty cheap. I highly recommend those.
Amazing.
Jenny, you mentioned example women's roles. I don't really have time to get super far into that, but that obviously is a really good question, because when you're looking at what the scriptures say about women and their roles in the church, questions arise as to whether or not
we're getting this right.
Something is like just a cultural thing of that time, or is it something that's supposed to be, established like forever? That's a good question. I'd love to get into some of those examples sometimes. One last thing though on it, do keep in mind that the best thing you can do is reading the text closely, because oftentimes we miss what the text itself says. I think about the story of the rich ruler that's mentioned in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. Mark 10 is where I remember it distinctly, because I teach most commonly from Mark 10 on it. And we just did it relatively recently. But in that story, Jesus tells the young man to sell everything that he owns, give it to the poor, he'll have riches in heaven, and come follow him. At the end of that, he turns, because the rich ruler walks away, he turns to his disciples and he goes, how hard it is for those with riches to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, my children, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I bring this up because lots of people have heard pastors come out and say that there is a gate in Jerusalem that was called the Eye of the Needle, the Needle Gate. Yeah. And that if you could just get a camel, like I've heard two different versions of this. If you took the burden off the camel's back, he'd be able to just go through the gate. Or if you got it down on his knees, and then people will use some kind of a spiritual interpretation, like you have to first remove your burden to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Or that the camel was carrying a bunch of goods and commerce that had to be let go. You couldn't come in the gate with all this stuff.
Exactly. Now here's the thing. Preachers who teach that are well-meaning. And they've heard it from people that they trust. They heard it from people that they trust. And it's not there. It's not real. It's not true. There is no evidence that any such gate ever existed in the time of Christ or at any other time. But we do have some evidence that in the Middle Ages that you had, without going into more.
Come on.
No. I'm not going to do that.
Not going to Cincinnati right now.
Not going to Cincinnati right now. But when the Crusaders took control of Jerusalem, Crusaders, of course, being quite wealthy, that they started dubbing certain gates the needle gates because they were trying to justify their wealth. Yeah. But there's no reason to think there was any such gate. But here's the thing. It doesn't even matter, because you might look at it and go, well, how am I going to know? Because I don't know the history. I can't know that history as well as people. I have to take people at their word. That's why I brought up listen to lots of different teachers. But there's this other thing. In that text, context will tell you. Because if you go a little bit further, the disciples then say, but then, Lord, who can be saved? You see, he had to be describing something that is impossible. Yeah. Because he said,
it's not just really hard.
It's not just really hard. It's not just something difficult. Because if it was just something that was difficult, they would have had a different response. But instead he says it's harder for a camel, or it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. The disciples are then saying, that's impossible. And they said, who can be saved? And this is a cultural thing that was true, that people need to understand, that Jews in that time believed that wealth was a sign of God's blessing, that poverty was a sign of God's curse. And so if the wealthy don't even get in, then who could possibly get in? And then Jesus says that wonderful thing, with men it is impossible, but not with God. With God, all things are possible. Amen. So context is more important than anything else. And if you can just read closely, oftentimes context will reveal things to you. And that's the best tool you can use.
Tom, you did it. I didn't think you were going to do it, but you did it.
Let's see. Did I make it by 5:30?
You marched down the field.
5:33. Is that a failure?
No. I mean, me and you and Matt will talk after. But for the people now, you did great.
Matt, are you okay?
No,
Matt gave the.
Matt's right over here.
I was looking over here,
yeah,
but
you never know where Matt is at any given time. But dude, thank you so much.
Yeah.
We are gonna take a little pause. Do you want to make that announcement now?
I've already made it several times, but yes, we'll be back.
And you wanted,
but it's not going to be until we're going to record on June 15th, probably next. But it'll release the following Tuesday, whatever day.
Well, and we have all sorts of ways that we want to be just allow you to have more time and space to tell us what's all the stuff in your
Yeah,
brain?
hopefully this summer we'll be able to do a lot more recording.
And did you want to tell everyone this is the last time that they can expect to see you in your little outfit here?
Yes, okay, I could tell them. Yeah, this little outfit is going to go away today because starting next week we hit summer weather.
Those are your announcements for the day. Hope you have a great time in your summer attire.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching, and Tom, as always, I will see you soon. Can I get a ride out of here?
Yes, you can.
Okay.